While the action has started here in Paris with some sensational matches already taking place in rugby sevens, in handball and of course in the football tournament, there's also a geopolitical storm brewing on the sidelines. It involves the USA, China, the IOC, WADA and the Salt Lake City bid for the Winter Games of 2034. And what it resembles is an old-fashioned Olympic sport, which is still contested actually, that of the fencing duel. In short, the USA has something called the Rodchenkov Act, which determines this. It can impose criminal sanctions on certain persons involved in international doping fraud conspiracies to provide restitution for victims of such conspiracies and to require the sharing of information with the US anti-doping agency to assist in its fight against doping and for other purposes. Essentially, it's been seen as a bit of a land grab for power that has traditionally been exercised by the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, which is based in Canada. It stems back to 23 positive doping tests for Chinese swimmers at a national meet inside China during COVID ahead of the Tokyo Olympic Games. When the story was exposed by German television station ARD, there were questions about transparency, questions about whether there'd been a WADA cover-up, and how thorough their investigation had been. All of those questions have been answered numerous times by WADA, but not to the satisfaction of either the US Anti-Doping Agency or many in the Western media. Then, in extraordinary circumstances yesterday, ahead of Salt Lake City being announced as the host of the 2034 Winter Olympics, the IOC stated that they had changed the host city contract. The IOC now can determine to cancel those games in Salt Lake City if it's determined that US officials are not giving full sovereignty to WADA, at least respecting the full sovereignty of WADA. The US Anti-Doping Agency has responded, saying the IOC is stooping to threats. WADA says it's going to take USADA to the Independent Review Compliance Committee. And there are some who are wondering whether China will legally prosecute the leaking of those documents, which identified a number of the swimmers, naming some who were minors. This is now a major arm wrestle of geopolitical proportions in world sport. There are some who are wondering whether the USA and the IOC and WADA can come back to the same table to progress this conversation. Olivier Niggli, it's an interesting time that's being faced around the world politically. We're here to celebrate the Paris 2024 Olympic Games, but there's still a lot of discussion around anti-doping, the China situation. And I guess when the IOC had inserted into a contract for a host of the Winter Games in 2034 for Salt Lake City, that criticism or, there must be full support of WADA in order for that contract to be prosecuted. They have the potential to take the games away from Salt Lake City. Has this just ramped up a situation where it seems like there is a political divide between what is happening in the USA and what is happening with WADA and trying to convince the world that anti-doping is on track, you are doing the right things, you are not being held hostage by particularly strong nations which may not do anti-doping in the way that other countries do?
Well, there's a lot of things in this question, but I think in order to understand what the IOC has decided to do, you need to understand the facts. The fact is that we have a situation which was claimed by some to be a doping case, and we have made it clear that it was a contamination case and not a doping case, that happened in China at a national competition where there was no American athletes present or involved in whatsoever. And since 4 months, we get permanent requests from the US, from different bodies, mainly political bodies, claiming that they should receive the full case file to review this file. This has culminated in a subpoena being served to the Director General of an international federation recently in the US. And I think that's what triggered this reaction from the sports movement. It's not just anti-doping. It's the fact that we are now talking about a situation where you have an event, a national event that happened in a sovereign country somewhere in the world, and another country, namely the US, are claiming that they have jurisdiction to review this case and potentially, to disagree with it or to take a sanction against athletes that were involved in this case. And if you extrapolate that and think that, then, everybody's going to do that. And then that, when, a US runner is being exonerated because he ate meat, or a synchronized swimmer is exonerated because she slept on the pillow of her father, we're going to request from China or from Germany or from Australia asking for the case file to review it. You can immediately understand that the whole system, the whole anti-doping system, but also the whole certainty in the world of sports collapse. And I think sports is genuinely concerned that one country would put itself above the other and decide that they have a right to review everything that's happening in the world. And I think that's what triggered this concern by the IOC, saying, well, you would like to have the games, you want to have the game, you want to have the biggest events in the world coming to your country, but then we're all gonna have to play by the same rule. That was why WADA was created. That's why we have a World Anti-Doping Code that is the same for everybody around the world. And if one player starts doing something completely outside the rule, then everybody has a problem. So the message is not about don't criticize WADA, or the message is not about, this is an anti-doping problem. The message is much broader than that. The message is we're gonna work all together in a harmonized fashion. Otherwise, the whole system lose any certainty in the way it is being run.
So this is the issue with the Rodchenkov Act, ironically named after the Russian who exposed all the problems and the cover-up in Sochi 2014. Is the idea now to try and get the Rodchenkov Act rescinded?
I don't know what the idea is. I mean, yesterday we heard support from the USOPC, from the state of Utah through the governor of Utah, from the mayor of Salt Lake, from the head of the BID, and it's for the Americans to find the solution so that they are playing with the other in the international scene. I'm not going to tell the American how they can do it or what they have to do, but they're going to have to do things that makes US being a player like any other country in the world, because there is no reason why the US should have the right to put themselves above the others. And that comes down to that. Now, I'll let the Americans find the solution how to fix the situation in which they put themselves. 3 or 4 years ago, when the Rodchenkov Act was proposed and passed, we raised the same concern. I mean, this is nothing new. We raised that concern and we said the Rodchenkov Act will be used politically. How can it be more political than what you are seeing now with the Chinese case that has nothing to do with the US? There's not even one US athlete involved in this competition, and that becomes, a major issue in the US.
You say that the US should not be above anybody else, but we know that as so-called leaders of the free world, they have been used to calling the shots because they stand on the side of right, they stand on the side of democracy, they stand on the side of good. Are we seeing a shift here? And are there countries that you think maybe have had enough and are calling out the US for that position, as you've just said? But how does that go from here? Because in the end, the Olympic movement relies very heavily on the US and the funding that comes from the US, and presumably funding that is then passed on to WADA.
I think that clearly the world is more complicated today than it was a few years ago, and without me commenting on the geopolitics, I think if there is one field in society which we should try to preserve, it's sport. And whatever happens in other areas and the tension that there may be, hopefully in sport we can preserve a harmonized system. anti-doping is probably unique in the sense that everybody is under the same rules all around the world. And it's probably one of the only so-called legislation that applies everywhere in the world. So the danger I see now, without going into the philosophy of today's world, is that by acting this way, the US are actually endangering a system that is unique and that is preserving harmonization into sport. And I hope we can find a solution to preserve that, because if sports collapse, or if organized sports become, complicated and subject to geopolitical tension, what are we going to offer to the young people? What are we going to offer to the world? I mean, this is one of the few things that's left. So I think there's a big responsibility of everybody there to, come back and look at it and realize that, the interest at stake and the danger of behaving these ways are consequential for the future of the world of sport.
What do you think is lying underneath this scenario? Why this particular case, and why so, I'll use the word rabid, the prosecution from the US side against WADA's handling of this? Is there some sort of a political move for a new system of anti-doping, one that the US is in charge of, rather than WADA in Canada?
I think there's a number of elements there that overlaps, when it comes to USADA, who are driving the attack there, clearly, I think that's right. I think USADA would like to see another system being put in place in which they probably play a bigger role than what they play today. But USADA took the opportunity of this case because it was involving China to get, politics involved into the matter, and certainly to get the interest of the US Congress and Senate, and they managed to do that. If it wasn't for China, I don't think this case would have taken that dimension in the US. We experienced that also previously, in the case of Russia, where you understand in the US that some of matters that relates to specific jurisdiction get the attention of everybody in the country, and that's clearly the case in this situation.
So, final two questions. One is, if Donald Trump becomes president again, how does that impact WADA? Was there any impact last time? I mean, the presidents of countries determine the direction that countries take. Do you have any sense on that?
I have no sense on that, and the future will tell. The US are one player in the anti-doping system. At the moment, they are actually having a seat on the WADA Executive Committee. They've been put there by the region, by the Americas, and they will have to decide what role they want to play going forward. Hopefully, the fight against doping is beyond any political rift between Democrats and Republicans, and they will remain committed to their athletes and to the fight against doping globally.
And finally then, is the anti-doping system rigorous enough to withstand all of the complications and all of the case-by-case scenarios that you have to handle, or does it need a complete review? And I also wonder whether this whole situation might have been avoided if it was made public at the time rather than being revealed so much later.
I think there's two things in this question. First of all, I think the anti-doping system is quite robust. I think the rules are quite robust. But the anti-doping system has also financial limits in the way they can operate. I mean, it's only a very tiny portion of the sports money that goes into anti-doping when you look at it. And therefore, the system has to be pragmatic. The system is there to, avoid that cheaters would be let into the system. But it means that judgment call have to be made, and that at the end of the day, even if not every case is being solved by the book, if at the end of the day everybody is comfortable and convinced that we're not dealing with a case of cheating, well, this might be acceptable within the system. We can discuss it. But the reality is that You got to be pragmatic, otherwise, you're going to have to get a different kind of budget in anti-doping. So that's clearly a reality that has to be taken into account, and it's not just WADA; it's also at anti-doping organization level. We review close to 3,000 cases every year. I mean, that's a lot of cases. They are not all complicated and so on, but that's a lot of cases. If we were to appeal every single cases that is not just by the book, we would have to appeal hundreds of cases every year, which we could not afford. But we are comfortable that many of these cases, even so there may be slight deviation from the codes, the end result is fine. The end result is not allowing a cheater to compete. And for us, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Should you have been more open about the case as it happened?
This is also an interesting question. We live in time where human rights, privacy, all of this is becoming more prominent, legally more prominent. I mean, we have a lot of these cases, and even in the code revision, the human right component has to be, center of what is, and that's fine. I mean, that's important, and we all respect that. The reality is that if you start publicly reporting things when they're actually, you have agreed and you've considered there's no doping case, and you expose these athletes and their reputation to the public, you actually are tainting their reputation for no reason. Because the fact is that even if the conclusion is that this was a contamination case, how the social media works and how things are operating, these athletes would immediately be put under the suspicious list and so on, even so they've done nothing wrong. And for us to report that in an anonymous fashion, which would be another option, so we would report, we had 23 athletes, they tested positive, but we came to the conclusion that this was a contamination, and we publicly put that out there. Then you open the door to speculation. Then people will start to say, who is it? And then you would have fake news, fake rumors, and so on. So how do we reconcile the need for transparency, which we agree, and the protection of the privacy of the athletes? That's not an easy, there's no easy answer there. And for us, the protection of the privacy of the athletes is more important than protecting our own self, because actually for us, it'd be much easier to report everything, be transparent, we would avoid the criticism, but we think it would be very unfair to the athletes.
Olivier Niggli, I do appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, JC.